What's up, YouTube? I'm David Warren, and welcome back to this week's video. Today, I'm going to give you guys an overview of what CRNA school has been like. This is going to be a two-part video. Part one, we're going to go over didactic, and then part two, we're going to go over clinical. It's going to be a long video, so I want to split it up into two parts. But first, we're going to cover what CRNA school was like in the didactic portion of my program. Let's jump into it. Before we dive into the content, I want to share with you a promotion by Lectruio. Lectruio is offering an NCLEX RN practice exam for all of you nursing students out there. This is going to be from April 15th to April 22nd. It is a 50-question exam, and at the end of the exam, you get to see how you scored in comparison to your peers, and you get to have a report on what you need to work on for the actual NCLEX RN exam. I'm going to link it below in the bio. Click on that and go check out the NCLEX RN practice exam from April 15th to April 22nd through Lectruio. All right, let's dive into the content. So we're going to cover in this part one video the didactic phase of my CRNA program, what that looks like, class specifics, and all of the things that you would be interested in knowing about CRNA school. But we're going to start way back when. I'm going to give you a brief overview of how we even got to this place to begin with. So I'm at National University out in Central California in Fresno. It is a 3-year, 36-month DNAP program, so Doctor of Nurse Anesthesia Practice. And then at the end of the program, you're eligible to sit for your national certification as a CRNA. So I applied to the program in like July, and then interviewed in September, I believe, and then was accepted, and then you have a January start. So you essentially have like a 6 to 8 month time frame of when you apply to when you will start, and it's a pretty quick turnover. So just know that going in, that it'll be a pretty quick turnover. I started in January of 2022, and so I really want to give you guys an overview of like what each part of that didactic phase looked like. So this program is divided up into quarters, so 4 quarters in a year. And I started in January of 2022, and the first quarter we took 4 classes. So we were in pharmacology concepts, advanced practice, or intro to evidence-based practice. Sorry, not advanced practice, intro to evidence. I'm having to like stretch my mind back all the way a couple years ago. So we'll start that all over again. So pharmacology concepts, intro to evidence-based practice, anatomy, and then anatomy lab. So those were the classes that we did my first quarter. And actually, I have some older videos that I posted around that time frame when all of this was still fresh in my mind about what that quarter was like. But this video, since I'm kind of towards the end now, I'm just going to do an overview of the whole shebang, whole 15 months that we spent doing didactic. So those were the 4 classes we were in that quarter. And in this particular program, I think all CRNA schools are extremely challenging, but this program in particular, the first quarter was probably the easiest, and it wasn't easy, but like looking back at what we did and what we like went through, the first quarter was definitely the easiest in comparison. And so I feel like National does a really good job at like kind of easing you into it, if that can be done. So the first quarter is extremely challenging, but looking back, like when I was in the first quarter, I was like, this is a lot, this is hard. But looking back now that I've been through everything since, I'm like, wow, that was actually really easy in comparison to what happened later on in the program. So the first quarter is probably going to be the easiest part. Not easy by any stretch, but easy compared to what you will be doing in the future. So the anatomy class, we really went over whole body anatomy from like start to finish. And the professor that taught the anatomy class also teaches the subsequent physiology classes. There are 3 physiology classes, and he teaches those as well. So you'll have this professor for a whole year. And then in the anatomy class, we went over whole body anatomy, didn't really dive much into physiology, like touched on a few physiology concepts, but it was more anatomy. And this was really cool because looking back now, I can see how this was super useful because we also all had to purchase butterfly IQ ultrasounds when we got accepted to the program. And so we started using ultrasound literally like the first week of the program, we had to start scanning ourselves and scanning each other and turning those in for assignments. And that really played a huge factor in being comfortable with the ultrasound. So when we arrived at clinical, we were ready to start doing regional anesthesia. The only thing, we weren't like poking each other with needles. So trying to find your needle on the ultrasound, that's what we learned in clinical, and then how to do the blocks. But we like got super familiar with the ultrasound in this anatomy class by scanning ourselves and scanning each other, which was really cool. And then in the anatomy lab, we had similar like exams, but it was more of like identifying structures. In the anatomy like lecture class, it was written exams, and then like applying what we learned. But in the anatomy lab class, it was simply just like identifying structures. We would be given a list of things that we would need to know, and then how to identify those structures, things like the brachial plexus, the lumbar plexus, the cervical plexus, drawing those out, knowing which nerves go where, which nerve roots make up ultimately which nerves, like things like that. And so that was kind of what the lab consisted of. And then we also did some more ultrasound scanning in lab as well when we were all together as a class. Um, and then the pharmacology concepts class was kind of an intro to um, like anesthesia pharmacology, I guess you could say. We went over really like the bulk, a lot of the like anesthesia forward drugs that we use every day in the OR. We went over that first quarter. Like we did all of the opiates, all of the IV induction agents like propofol or etomidate, ketamine, and then we went over all the volatile anesthetics like sevoflurane, desflurane, isoflurane, nitrous, all of the things that we use day in and day out in the OR, which I thought was really interesting because I'm like, we just started like a couple days ago and we're already going over like these very anesthesia forward and anesthesia specific drugs. Whereas I feel like some programs, you probably won't get that true anesthesia pharmacology until later on. And so it was really cool to like get that information right off the bat. And then we also had two subsequent pharmacology classes. So we had 3 pharmacology classes in total, and this was the first, and each one kind of built on the next. So that's what the pharmacology class looked like, very forward on like anesthesia specific drugs and things that we use every single day in the OR. And I will say the pharmacology, most of you guys know, as a nurse practitioner prior to going to CRNA school, and the pharmacology was like very different compared to the NP pharmacology that I went through. In anesthesia pharmacology, you go down to the cellular level, so you're learning about which ions are exchanged by which drugs. And an example of this is propofol. So propofol is probably the most common like anesthetic agent that we use in the OR. Like we use it every single day, almost on every single patient, unless there's some rare exception. And so propofol is a GABA agonist. And so GABA is a neurotransmitter in the brain. And whenever propofol binds to the GABA receptor, it opens the GABA receptor and it increases chloride conductance, and that hyperpolarizes the neurons. So the neurons are essentially turned off and they're not firing. And so you learn like every drug just like that, down to the cellular level, what the mechanism of action is, all of the things that you have to know. And that's just like one example, but you learn that for all of our anesthetic drugs, all of the, and it gets like very in depth, especially with the volatile anesthetics where they're hitting on multiple different receptors, or like Precedex that hits on a bunch of different receptors in the spinal cord, in the brain, in the periphery, like everywhere. You have to know all of those and all the effects and all the ions that are exchanged, all of those like cellular things, just bringing back horrible memories. But that's kind of what the pharmacology is like in anesthesia school. You're down to the cellular level, learning like what intracellular responses are created by certain drugs and how that affects the whole body physiology. And then our evidence-based practice course. This course was literally just an intro to like evidence-based practice. It was not much different than what like I did in NP school. We had to choose like a PICO question and then do some research on that, put a project together, and then present the project. And this was an asynchronous course, so no live component here. Everything was open from day one, so we could like work ahead if we needed to. We had discussion postings in that class as well. So again, probably the easiest quarter that we had through the whole program. So that's what the first quarter looked like. Second quarter is where things really started to ramp up. We started the physiology sequence. So we did physiology 1, and then we started principles of anesthesia. And so the principles of anesthesia, that was a 4-course sequence, I believe we did. Yeah, principles 1, 2, 3, and 4. So we started principles of anesthesia that second quarter, and then we did another pharmacology class, and then we did a simulation lab. This is where things again started to really ramp up in multiple different courses. So you start really learning anesthesia related content in the principles of anesthesia course. And again, there were 4 courses that we had for that particular class sequence. And in this course, we learned things like airway management, the machine, the not the ultrasound machine, the anesthesia machine, and trying to remember, like managing difficult airways, like things related to basic stuff that you would deal with in the OR. So like airway management, doing all the components of the anesthesia machine. Those were kind of the main things that I remember from that course. There were a lot more, but that's kind of what stood out to me. Almost 3 years later now. And then in our pharmacology class, we did more anesthesia specific drugs. So things like neuromuscular blockers. Trying to remember what else we covered in that class. It's really slipping my mind. But it was much like that first pharmacology class that we had. It was just built on with more anesthesia drugs and more anesthesia related content. But it was much of the same as far as learning stuff down to the cellular level, those cellular responses. And it's interesting now because like we have to take our C exam and our board exam, at the end of this year. And all of that stuff is fair game. And I still remember a lot of it, but a lot of it has begun like exiting. And so I have to refresh myself very frequently when I'm studying about those like intracellular responses with pharmacology. So that's kind of what the pharmacology class looked like and the principles of anesthesia class. The simulation class, we actually went to our sim lab on campus, and the sim lab is essentially like 2 ORs. You have like 2 ORs in one big room, and you have an OR table, you have an anesthesia machine, and all like the drugs and anesthesia equipment that you would have access to in the OR. And in this class, in this particular simulation lab, we went over the anesthesia machine and doing like an anesthesia machine check and kind of what all that entailed. And then we went over things like basic airway management, like how to intubate, how to put in an LMA, how to use the video laryngoscope, what a bougie is, like all the things that go with airway management. And so it's kind of a basic intro course to airway management. And then starting like at the middle of the quarter, we did like an induction and then emergency and extubation, like from start to finish, which I thought was pretty interesting. Actually, it was like our first time in sim lab, and we're already like practicing our inductions, and then kind of like what a basic induction looks like, all the steps that go with that, and then doing like an emergency and extubation. Did it from start to finish. Learning that first, doing it in that first simulation class was super interesting. And that's something that we do every single day now in the OR is, inducing and then emerging and extubating. So something that still applies today. And that's kind of what the second quarter looked of the physiology class. I didn't cover that. The physiology class, this was by far the hardest class that we had to take in anesthesia school. It was just extremely challenging. The same professor that taught our anatomy class. And so, as I mentioned earlier, we have the one anatomy class and then physiology 1, 2, and 3. So 4 classes total, 3 physiology courses, just extremely challenging classes, super packed with information. And the 3 subsequent physiology classes were essentially like an in-depth view of the anatomy class. So we would essentially go back over what we learned in anatomy, just down to a super in-depth level. And so the first physiology course was all about like, trying to even remember now, it's been so long, all about the like cellular, like biochemistry and cell biology and like neurotransmitters and the action potential. Like the whole class revolved around all of that, like at the cellular level, what ions are exchanging when. And it was just it was a nightmare, honestly. Like really bad times. Like I didn't know if I was going to get through that class. It was extremely challenging, by far the hardest class. It got a little better in subsequent quarters, but after we kind of got used to what we were in for, because like I said, that first quarter was easy comparatively speaking, and then second quarter ramps way up, and then third quarter even gets ramped up more. And so it just gets harder as time goes on. And so that's kind of what the second quarter looks like. I'll make sure I covered all the courses. So we had the pharmacology, we talked about that. Physiology, we talked about that. Principles of anesthesia, I covered that. And then simulation lab, we covered that. And so for the next two more quarters, so we're in quarter two now. So for quarters 3 and 4, it's going to look very similar to what that quarter looked like. We're going to take essentially the same classes, just different topics. So quarter 3 was like the summer quarter, and we did principles of anesthesia 2, pharmacology 3, and simulation 3, and what was the last quarter? I can't remember the last class we did. So we did physiology, principles of anesthesia 2, pharmacology, and simulation. Those are four classes. We're on the same page now. So the simulation lab was kind of much the same simulation lab, same instructor. This quarter we did like lines, I believe, like central lines, arterial lines. That's really what stood out in that quarter, central lines and arterial lines. So we really went over like in depth how to put those in, different locations that we put them in at, how to use ultrasound guidance. And then we started doing some regional anesthesia as well, like the different blocks that we would do, like an interscalene block, which would be like right here on the neck, or a supraclavicular block, which is right above the clavicle, or an infraclavicular right in this area here, an axillary block like under the arm here. And then some lower extremity blocks. I can't remember if we did lower extremity that quarter, but we did upper extremity for sure. And then in our physiology course, it was much of the same, like went this quarter, I think it was like the GI system. So the first was like more neuro, and then second, the physiology 2. So physiology 1 last quarter, physiology 2 this quarter was more like GI and autonomic nervous system, and then endocrine. Like, again, horrible memories of those classes, but still stuff that applies today. Because even when I'm like taking practice exams, I'm like, wow, that really applies. Like I still need to know that stuff. And then in our pharmacology class, again, much the same. Like we went over anesthesia specific drugs and things that we would like need to know. And this was the last pharmacology course. It was pharmacology 3, which was our last pharmacology like sequence course, which was to be welcomed because I was very tired of pharmacology by the end of that sequence for sure. And then in our principles class, this was super interesting. I do remember this for sure. I remember a lot about this class. This was a very challenging course because there was so much information. Like it was unbelievable. We literally had at least, oh my goodness, I want to say 20 to 25 PowerPoint presentations per week that we had to get through. And then we had an exam every like third week. And so like at the end of the quarter, I had it added up at one point. We had, gosh, over 200 something PowerPoint presentations that we had like for the final. And so this course really ramped up that third quarter for whatever reason. I don't know why. It was just like a disaster in my mind, just because it was so challenged, so much information is so challenging. But yeah, we had at least 15 to 20 PowerPoints per week to get through. And we did cardiac surgery, vascular surgery, and then ultrasound guided regional blocks, like knowing textbook wise, like what you need to know for blocks. And so we did all the upper extremity blocks, as I mentioned earlier, interscalene, supraclavicular, infraclavicular, axillary, a PEX block, which is right here on the chest. We did the lower extremity blocks, so femoral nerve block, fascia iliaca, pang block, popliteal nerve block, adductor canal, ankle blocks. I'm trying to figure out what block I missed on the lower leg. Those are the main ones that we went over. And then some like in the newer technology or newer blocks like the erector spinae block. There are just tons of blocks out there. We went over the IPAC block for the posterior capsule of the knee. Yeah, all the blocks plus vascular surgery plus thoracic surgery. Which, as you can imagine, is probably a lot of content. After doing my cardiac and thoracic rotation, I'm like, yeah, that was a lot of content, but much needed because you need to know that kind of stuff. So that's what the principles course looked like. Yeah, simulation. I think I went over all the courses. That was third quarter. Fourth quarter was definitely, Trying to remember. I think it was pretty challenging. It was all challenging. The fourth quarter, I remember one class in particular, which we'll get to, was very challenging. So in our fourth quarter, we had a simulation lab. We had principles of anesthesia. We had physiology, and we had physical assessment. Those are the four. It's like I know what the class starts. It takes a minute to make the connection. All right, so we'll start with the hardest course, actually, assessment, physical assessment. That was by far the hardest course this quarter. Was super interesting. It was very anesthesia specific. And so, like, I've taken advanced physical assessment in NP school, obviously, but this particular class was very anesthesia specific in by way of like knowing what kind of assessment, diagnostic testing you need on a patient before you bring them back to the OR to put them under anesthesia. Very this looking back now, like in all of the didactic courses we took, this course is by far one of the most important now that I'm in my clinical journey. And I say that because every single day we have to pre-op patients and we have to determine, like, are they safe enough to bring back to the OR to undergo if we're doing general anesthetic, are they safe enough to undergo general anesthetic? Or do we need to order testing on them? Do they need a cardiology referral? Do they need an EKG? Do they need an echo? Do we need to cancel the case? Like, all of these things we learned in that assessment course, and like super, 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 you can't stress enough how useful this course was. Now that I've started my clinical journey, especially doing preoperative stuff, because we're the last, like, anesthesia is the last line. Like, we're ultimately the ones who have the power to cancel the case if we don't feel that the patient is safe enough to undergo anesthesia. And so the line literally stops with us. And so knowing that and being able to recognize, like, when the patient needs additional testing or when they need to be canceled or optimized or whatever, that's super helpful. And so we went into detail on all of that in this class. And it wasn't so much a physical assessment course as it was a preoperative assessment in, like, optimization, knowing, is the patient optimized for surgery? And obviously this is for elective procedures. If you're doing trauma surgery or something emergent where the patient, like, has to go to the OR right now, you just deal with it to the best of your ability. But for elective surgery, like if I'm electively having my knee replaced, like, what is the like, what does that look like? What is the patient optimized? Does the patient need referrals to see specialists before they undergo anesthesia? All of those things. And so that course was super helpful in that regard. And then our principles of anesthesia course, much of the same, like anesthesia specific content, very like anesthesia specific. I can't remember the exact topics we went over in that class, but it was more of the same, of like learning actual anesthesia. And then in our simulation course, we went over a like pediatric induction. So pediatric inductions are usually different than our adult inductions. So adults come to the OR with an IV in place, and we do an IV induction. So we just give them propofol and then paralytics and then intubate or LMA or whatever you're going to do. And then a pediatric induction is quite different. If they have an IV, it's much of the same. But if they don't have an IV, typically they don't like to stick kids in the preoperative area. And this is interesting to me because, I'm coming from emergency medicine, if you know my background, and like not every kid got an IV, but a lot of kids got IVs, and we didn't do anything to sedate them. We just hold them down and like start the IV. But in the OR, a little bit different. Like, we don't torture kids and hold them down and start IVs in pre-op. We'll bring them back to the OR and do a mask induction. So we'll literally call it gassing them down. So we'll just gas the kid down. We'll turn our SIVO all the way up to 8%, turn nitrous on, and gas the kid down. Once they're, into a deep plane of anesthesia past stage 2, then we'll start the IV, which actually really helps because our volatile anesthetics vasodilate. And so it just helps bring the veins out even more, and a very easy IV start after you get gas on board. So that's how we do that. We had to learn how to do that. All the things that go with that, like how to manage a laryngospasm, how to break a spasm, all those things that can happen if you're doing an inhalation induction. And then we also did spinals and epidurals this quarter as well, like how to put in spinals and epidurals. And I'm going to be quite honest with you. I say that we did the spinals and epidurals this quarter. It may have been the last quarter, the third quarter that we did that. I know we did, like I said earlier, like the central lines, arterial lines, and some nerve blocks. We may have done neuraxial anesthesia that quarter as well, or we did it this quarter. I can't remember. I know we did peds inhalation induction this quarter, which was, we don't, to be honest with you, like we have a peds rotation. We did a bunch of peds, but like at my current site, I haven't done a pediatric case in almost 3 months now. And so, but like knowing how to do it in the back of your head, you have to know how to do that in case you get a kid that, you have to take back to the OR. So, um, the physiology course, this was our final physiology course. And I do remember this course as well because we went over renal physiology and what else did we do? We did renal and respiratory, I believe. Yeah, because this was probably, again, a really hard physiology class. All the respiratory stuff was super fascinating, but just like kind of like abstract and out there. And then the renal the same way, like all of the renal, like huge props. If you do anything with nephrology, like huge props to you. You're like one of the smartest people in the world, literally. Learning all the renal physiology is not for the faint of heart, and that's what we did that quarter. So that's kind of what that quarter looked like. Principles of anesthesia, more anesthesia content, pharmacology. Sorry, not pharmacology. We didn't even have pharmacology. Assessment, principal anesthesia, assessment, simulation lab. And what was the last one? I can't remember. I'm already like, this is what anesthesia school does to you. So we had principles of anesthesia, simulation lab, assessment, and physiology. That's 4. We're stopping there. All right. So this was the end of the first year, end of year 1 of CRNA school. We had, at this point, we had one more quarter to go before we started our clinical rotations. And so this brought us to December. We had like 3 weeks off, and then we came back, and then we started our final quarter of didactic. And so this next quarter was the easiest quarter that we had as far as content load. But there's an exception here. As I said earlier, the first quarter was the easiest. This quarter was also easier in terms of content, but we had the C exam to worry about. So this whole like C exam was kind of brewing and like looming in the background, and it was sneaking up very quickly. So the C exam, SEE, is self-evaluation exam, and it's essentially like a mock board exam that we had to take our last quarter of didactic, and we had to pass that exam to even make it to clinical. And so you can imagine like all this like looming in the background. And this is like, the C exam is not given by the school, like it's given by the NB CRNAs, so National Board of Certification and Recertification for Nurse Anesthetists. So like our credentialing body or certifying body. And so we had to go to like Pearson VUE to take this test, 240 questions. Not to mention, we have to take it again in November. We have to pass it again to graduate. So still that looming fear of death and doom is still there today, just like it was at this particular time trying to take the C exam the first go around. So that final quarter, we had to take the C exam at some point, and we had to pass it. Essentially like pass it to go on. I have a whole video on the C exam and how I prepped. It's probably, if you're not in anesthesia school, it's probably not worth watching, just because like you're not gonna be taken if you're not in anesthesia school. So I'll save you the like 20 minutes that I spent rambling about the C exam. But anyway, the C exam is a thing. Had to take it that final quarter of didactic. So our final quarter of didactic, we were in, the classes looked like a simulation class, principles of anesthesia 4, biostatistics, and I'm trying to remember the 4th class. Let me think. We'll come back to it. So we're going to start with our simulation lab. Simulation lab was managing emergencies, intraoperative emergencies. And this was super interesting and very useful. We were given like case scenarios, and like by the end of the quarter we had like 20 case scenarios, and our professor would be like, okay, you're taking case 2 today, and case 2 would be like a 20-something-year-old with a lap appy, or whatever the procedure was, and we would have to induce the patient, manage the patient intraoperatively, and emergent extubate the patient. And that was the simulation. We had 2 exams, but it was managing intraoperative emergencies. So each of those patients would have some kind of emergency, like a severe bronchospasm, an unanticipated difficult airway, a laryngospasm, anaphylaxis, all the things that could potentially be life-threatening and kill you in the OR. That's what would happen. Hypoxemia, trying to manage and identify what was causing the hypoxia or hypoxemia. Um, yeah, that's what the simulation lab looked like. Super useful because even today, like if you have a bronchospasm or laryngospasm, knowing how to manage that comes back to this course for me. And so it was very useful. And then so we had simulation, principles of anesthesia. We went over things like transplant anesthesia, trauma anesthesia, and critical care. It was pretty light, actually. The material sounds very challenging, but by this time we've covered enough of anesthesia material that we can like walk through a lot of the scenarios. So that course wasn't too bad. And then we had biostatistics, and our biostatistics course was asynchronous. So much like the evidence-based practice course, our first quarter, everything was opened up and we had a textbook and we could like go at our own pace. And so this course would come into play when we're doing our DNAP projects, which maybe I'll do a separate video on. This is also, our DNAP projects are lingering in the background like death and doom as well, much like the C exam was. And then our final class that we were in, I finally remember what it was. It is like a professional aspect of a nurse anesthesia course. I can't remember the exact title of it, but it was essentially a class that dealt with like ethics and all of the like professional roles and things that go with being in CRNA school, or being a CRNA, not CRNA school. So that's what that class looked like. It was asynchronous as well, although we did have weekly, so it wasn't completely asynchronous, but we did have weekly meetings, weekly like Zoom meetings. And the residents had to like put together the presentations for like the information that week, and we would present it to the class. And so it was much like engaging in public speaking and then coming up with like being able to teach, that sort of thing. That course wasn't too bad from what I remember. And then the C exam, literally the C exam was like the thing looming in the background. And so we would have to do Apex to prepare for that. So Apex Anesthesia is like a software, like an online review company for CRNAs or people taking the like CRNA board exam. And so that's the like resource that we would use to study for the C exam. We also had Prodigy, which is good for like practice questions. But two like review courses that we had to like pay for way back when. They were also incorporated into our classes along this whole year, 15-month journey. And then we would study those as well to prepare for the C exam. We weren't like mandated to do anything to prepare. It was just like, hey, you have the C exam, you have to make the certain score, you have to make a 400 on the C exam. And yeah, that's it. Go take it whenever. So we weren't really given much direction on like, this is what you need to do to make sure you achieve that score. But we all kind of knew like Apex was the way to go to like make sure we were well prepared to pass that exam. And so I spent the majority of this quarter just doing Apex, also like the other content that we had to do for our classes. But like I said, the class load wasn't that bad. If we didn't have the C exam, it would have been the easiest quarter. But with the C exam looming back here like death and darkness, doing Apex really consumed all of my time. I was doing at least 3 to 4 hours of Apex every single day for 3 months. And that got me up to speed. And I did extremely well on my C exam the first time. I made a 472, which like was really good for me. And I'm just hoping I can do that again here in a few months whenever we get ready. So this video has been extremely long. I'm going to stop it here. This is what an overview of didactic CRNA school at National was like for me and my experience. It brings back like trauma, trying to recall all these things that happened, over the past 2 or 3 years. This is what the first 15 months of CRNA school looked like. We'll do part 2, a clinical recap, and kind of what the rest of this year looks like for me as well. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.